The trial of Sean Diddy Combs reached another key stage with a hearing dedicated to two requests from his defense team: a post-verdict acquittal, known as a Rule 29 motion, or the opening of a brand new trial. No decision was made on the spot, but the exchanges revealed the strategies of both sides and the judge's stance. From the outset, Judge Aaron set the tone. He told the defense they were not required to use all the time allotted for oral arguments, since their points had already been laid out extensively in written briefs. It was a clear signal that he was deeply familiar with the case and expected only precise clarifications. Diddy's attorney, Alexandra Shapiro, then took the floor. Her line of defense was to argue that certain issues raised by the prosecution did not fall under the scope of the Mann Act, a federal law prohibiting the transportation of individuals across state lines for acts deemed prostitution. According to her, what the prosecution presented as prostitution was actually staged, film performances, something closer to free expression than criminal conduct. The prosecution, represented by Emily Johnson and Slavic, immediately pushed back. In their view, these arguments should have been filed much earlier, before the trial even began, through a Rule 12 motion. In other words, the defense was out of time. And even if the court entertained the substance, prosecutors argued that filming did not erase the nature of the act. If people were transported and paid for sexual activity, it squarely fit the definition of the Mann Act. Judge Aaron seized the opportunity to test the strength of these arguments. He pressed the defense on why the mere presence of a camera would rule out prostitution. He offered a concrete example. If someone takes a client to a brothel and pays on their behalf, can that truly not be considered prostitution? The question highlighted the judge's skepticism toward the defense's strategy. In response, Shapiro stressed that the encounters were performed and consensual, reminding the court that past decisions had recognized potential First Amendment protections. But the prosecution maintained that such nuances did not alter the core facts. There was organization, transport, and financial compensation, all sufficient to trigger the statute. The hearing then dove deeper into the core issues. Judge Aaron kept pressing the defense on the logic of its position. To him, the notion that filming could transform illegal conduct into constitutionally protected expression seemed difficult to sustain. Shapiro tried to refine her stance. She argued that the meetings at issue were not standard prostitution transactions, but staged, consensual performances captured on film. In her view, this should be seen as a form of performance, not a crime. She emphasized that if participants consented to being filmed, the acts leaned more toward intimate expression than commercial sex, prohibited under the Mann Act. But this defense quickly hit a wall. The prosecution reminded the court that not everything is shielded by free expression. There are clear limits to the First Amendment, especially when underlying conduct is illegal. For Johnson and Slavic, the defense's claim amounted to saying that the presence of a camera wipes away any offense. In reality, transporting someone across state lines, arranging travel, or providing payment was more than enough to establish a Mann Act violation. The judge then shifted the discussion to the concept of responsibility. He noted that even if Diddy did not personally pay or arrange every detail, he could still be held accountable if he knowingly caused or orchestrated the acts. The law refers to this as willfully cause, deliberately provoking or directing an illegal act. In other words, one doesn't need to hand over the money or drive the car. If the organization happened at his request or under his control, liability still attaches. Several times, Judge Aaron used straightforward examples to illustrate the point. One of them was that a client who brings a friend to a brothel and pays for him cannot claim it isn't prostitution. These analogies underscored how little weight the defense's distinctions carried when applied to real-world scenarios. Facing this line of questioning, the defense tried to steer the conversation back by citing prior cases where courts had recognized protection for filmed content. But prosecutors quickly countered that those precedents applied to completely different contexts, where the underlying conduct was not itself illegal. Here, they argued the violation was clear. Transport, payment, and intent were all present. The impression left in the courtroom was that Judge Aaron was determined to probe the defense's contradictions. His questions weren't idle curiosity, but deliberate tests of whether the arguments could hold up in practice. And as the minutes went by, it became increasingly difficult for Shapiro to persuade the court that freedom of expression could erase the strict boundaries of the Mann Act. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that the defense's strategy was struggling to gain traction. Shapiro continued her explanations, but Judge Aaron's questions remained sharp and difficult to sidestep. The prosecution, meanwhile, hammered home that the facts spoke for themselves and that attempts to reframe them as filmed performances could not hide the underlying reality. The judge also underscored a procedural issue. Even if some arguments carried weight, their late filing was a problem. He reminded the defense that the law requires challenges of this kind to be made before trial. To him, the defense was effectively asking for a second chance it might no longer be entitled to. For the prosecution, Emily Johnson closed by stressing the consistency of the case. The law, she said, is unambiguous. Transporting, organizing, or compensating in the context of interstate prostitution falls squarely under the Mann Act. No camera, no staging can change that. Slavic added that the defense's theory would create an exception the law does not provide, effectively gutting the statute of its meaning. Throughout, the judge projected a steady skepticism toward the defense. Still true to his role, he refrained from making any immediate ruling. He said he would take time to review all the briefs and arguments before deciding. For now, everything remains pending. For Diddy, this uncertainty carries enormous weight. If the Rule 29 motion succeeds, the verdict could be overturned, a massive victory. If a new trial is granted, the legal battle starts over, but with another chance at defense. If both requests are denied, the next step will be sentencing, followed by a possible appeal. What emerges from this hearing is a stark contrast between the defense's strategy and the strict reading of the law favored by prosecutors and the court. On one side, an attempt to invoke free expression as a shield. On the other, a focus on the hard facts, transport, organization, money that cannot be ignored. The case has now entered a waiting phase. Judge Aaron will issue his decision later, and that ruling will directly shape what happens next. For the moment, the only certainty is that the Diddy case is far from over, and every step continues to draw intense public and legal scrutiny.